Good afternoon, and welcome to HRP's webinar presented today on methylene chloride, perchloroethylene, and trichloroethylene. My name is Jackie Baxley, and I'll be leading us through the webinar today. Just a few administrative tidbits before we hop into the content. Here in a few moments, my colleague is going to upload some handouts to the chat. So everybody should have access to those handouts by accessing the chat here in just a few moments. We are recording this webinar as well, and we'll distribute that recording after the webinar. So if after you're participating in this webinar, you're thinking, man, I really wish my colleague so-and-so could have listened into that. Well, they can, because we'll be recording it, and that recording will be made available to you. We will take questions at the end of the webinar as well. So you're welcome to use either the chat function or the Q&A function to enter in those questions, whichever you're most comfortable using. And if you have a bit of a nuanced question, maybe one that requires a little bit of discussion and in additional detail and context, my contact information will be available to you at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have a bit more of a nuanced question that doesn't really work well in answering in the general terms of the webinar format, or maybe you just don't want to type in that level of detail in the chat and Q&A function. So with those administrative details out of the way, let's go ahead and hop right into our topic on EPA's restrictions on methylene chloride, perchloroethylene, and trichloroethylene. And this webinar is being brought to you today by HRP Associates. For over 40 years, HRP has worked with our clients to assure that we move their environment forward, meaning we work to minimize environmental risk associated with our clients' projects and help them reach their business goals. We're a multidisciplinary environmental compliance and engineering firm with several offices across the country. My name is Jackie Baxley, and I lead our environmental health and safety and sustainability practice relative to the services we provide to our stakeholders. I have over 25 years of experience with environmental health and safety and sustainability, and I'll be blending that experience as we go through our topic today. Now, here in a few minutes, my colleague is going to upload some handouts to the chat function. You're going to have two handouts that are available to you. One of the handouts is just a copy of all the slides and content that we're reviewing so that you'll have that available to you. And then the second handout is an acronyms and definitions and helpful links. So any website or link that I reference in the webinar today will be available in a clickable format in that second handout. So you'll have those available to you beyond today's webinar. And in our webinar today, first we're going to start with just introducing you to these solvents that have these new regulations associated with them. And we'll very high level introduce you to TSCA. We'll also discuss in detail these recent regulatory actions regarding methylene chloride, trichloroethylene, and perchloroethylene, and what these prohibitions mean, and also if you are allowed to continue to use these chemicals of concern, what are the associated workplace chemical protection programs and protocols you're going to need to put into place to be able to continue to use these solvents. Now, a little bit of a bonus content, hot off the presses from yesterday, where it is not directly related to our content today. We did have a webinar earlier in the year relative to the TSCA PFAS reporting rule. So you get a little bonus content today because just yesterday, EPA published in the Federal Register an interim rule that pushes the due date for the TSCA PFAS reporting rule. Those of you that have been making progress in the TSCA PFAS reporting rule, you have just been given the gift of time. The reporting platform was supposed to open in July of this year, but EPA has not completed that software associated with the reporting platform. So now we are expecting the reporting platform to open up in April of 2026. And where the reports were originally going to be due in January, they are now going to be due October 13th of 2026. So everybody has the gift of time relative to continuing to assess their compliance relative to the TSCA PFAS reporting rule. Now, this postponement does not impact at all PFAS reporting associated with your EPCRA TRI reports that are due July 1. Now, if everything that I just said is totally Greek to you and you're not familiar with EPCRA TRI reports, you're not familiar with the TSCA PFAS reporting rule, but you're interested in learning more, in that handout my colleague just loaded, we have links to the webinars that we completed earlier in the year. We did a webinar on the TSCA PFAS reporting rule in February, and we did just last month a webinar on the EPCRA TRI reporting. So if you want a little bit more information about those rules and what this postponement means, feel free to refer to those historical webinars. All right, now let's hop into the content of the day. So first, let's introduce you to these solvents that now have some regulatory action associated with them. Starting first with methylene chloride. So methylene chloride, which you'll see abbreviated throughout the presentation as MC, is a colorless liquid and a volatile chemical with a sweet odor. This solvent's been widely used by a variety of consumer and commercial applications, including adhesives, sealants, automotive products, and paint and coating removers. It's also a chemical that we know is widely used in laboratory settings as well for a very specific analytical analysis. Hazards are well established associated with methylene chloride, including risk of cancer and non-cancer health effects. It's a neurotoxin, it has liver effects, and it can even result in death. Routes of exposure for methylene chloride include both inhalation potential as well as dermal potential. Perchloroethylene, which you'll hear me refer to as PCE or PERC throughout this presentation, is a colorless liquid and a volatile chemical with a mildly sweet odor. This solvent also has been widely used historically. In consumer applications, we've seen it in brake cleaners and adhesives. In commercial use, it's historically been used in dry cleaning operations, and it has numerous and widespread use in industrial applications, including an intermediate in the production of refrigerants, processing aid at petroleum refineries, and we see it quite often in vapor degreasing as well. And just like methylene chloride, the hazards associated with PERC or PCE are well established. And the health hazards include kidney and liver and immune system damage, neuro and reproductive toxicity concerns, and also causes cancer. And very similar to methylene chloride, the routes of exposure that we see with PCE are both through inhalation, which means breathing in, as well as dermal, which means from contact with the skin. And then finally, the last solvent that's going to be a part of our presentation today is trichloroethylene, which you'll hear me refer to as TCE. And TCE is non-flammable, colorless, volatile organic chemical with a slightly sweet odor. Just like all the other solvents, this is one that's been widely used. In the consumer applications, we've seen it in cleaning and furniture care products, and arts and crafts sprays and coatings, and in various automotive care products. In industrial settings, it's widely used. We see it in cleaning, we see it in degreasing, we see it in lubricants, adhesives, sealants, paints, and coatings. And just like the other two, hazards are well established. We see liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma potentials. We see damage to central nervous system, liver, kidneys, immune system, and reproductive organs, and even fetal heart defects as well. And just like the other two, we can potentially be exposed to TCE through inhalation, breathing in, or dermal, touching the skin. Now, the Toxic Substance Control Act, also known as TSCA, is an environmental regulation that we've had for quite some time. It was originally passed in the mid 1970s, which is when we saw a lot of activity with some of the environmental regulations that we still maneuver through today. And when TSCA was passed, there was this presumption that was kind of baked into TSCA, and the presumption was that chemicals already in commerce were considered safe unless otherwise proven. And TSCA is kind of the primary law governing chemicals, so this was a pretty bold presumption relative to the initial passing of TSCA. Lesson learned, we realized that all chemicals were not necessarily safe. And so in 2016, under the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, we saw a shift of that presumption of safety. And under the Lautenberg Act, there was a mandatory requirement for EPA to evaluate existing chemicals that were originally presumed potentially safe, to evaluate existing chemicals with clear and enforceable deadlines for those evaluations. So the three chemicals we're talking about today, methylene chloride, TCE, and PCE, were part of the first 10 chemical substances that were to be evaluated for potential risks to human health and the environment under the Lautenberg Act. And then as a part of the Lautenberg Act, if through these risk evaluations, if it was determined that the chemical posed an unreasonable risk of injury or health or the environment under the conditions of use, then EPA must, through law, provide regulatory requirements relative to those chemicals. And so that's what we're seeing today with these three, and that's what we'll be presenting to you today with these three, are the rules that EPA has passed because these chemical substances, methylene chloride, TCE, and PCE, have been deemed to pose an unreasonable risk. All right, so let's talk about the recent regulatory action. So with the three chemicals, I'm going to, throughout this presentation, we're going to kind of talk holistically about these new risk-based rules. We're going to introduce kind of the rules as a whole. They have a very similar structure, but we'll talk about the different nuances between methylene chloride, the PCE rule, and the TCE rule. So all of these have been codified within the Code of Federal Regulations. If you're not familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations, it's where we can find all of our environmental rules and regulations in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And each one of these rules you will find in 40 CFR Part 751. Subpart B is where we'll find the rules regarding methylene chloride. Subpart G are the rules regarding PCE, and Subpart D, the rules around TCE. Now, the methylene chloride rule is what we call a phase-out rule. So it's not a complete ban. There are some applications that are going to be banned, but there are some applications that are going to be allowed to continue. Now, also relative to the methylene chloride rule, there is a regulatory threshold. And what we mean by that is methylene chloride has to be in the chemical or product at 0.1% or more for it to be subject to this rule. In other words, if methylene chloride is in a product less than 0.1%, it's considered de minimis and not subject to this rule. The effective date of the methylene chloride rule was from last year. Last summer was when the methylene chloride rule went into effect. So this one's a little bit more established relative to the implementation dates and what we'll be talking about today. And within the handout that my colleague uploaded to the chat, so you should see those handouts in the chat. The handout, we have direct links to these EPA resources. EPA has a dedicated page for the methylene chloride rule. They have a fact sheet for the methylene chloride rule, which is a easier to reference 2-page document. And then they have a full compliance guide. So if at the end of this presentation, if you're like, okay, this methylene chloride rule is going to apply to me, then those three links that are provided in the handout, you will find very helpful as you navigate your obligations. Now, do note, methylene chloride, not only do we have this rule under TSCA that you're going to need to be aware of for the continued use of methylene chloride, but also recognize that OSHA also has a standard specifically for methylene chloride. So you're going to need to navigate both the EPA rule under TSCA and the OSHA rule for methylene chloride. Now, PCE is also a phase out. So there will be some authorized continued use with very specific requirements. Also has that 0.1% threshold relative to PCE being in a product for it to be subject to this rule. This rule is effective at the beginning of this year, so it went into effect in January of 2025. And EPA similarly has a dedicated webpage for this rule and a fact sheet that you will find helpful if you do find that this PCE rule is going to apply to you. Now, TCE, this rule is a ban. So as you read through the TCE rule, you will see that all uses of TCE will eventually be banned. Similarly, there's a 0.1% regulatory threshold for TCE, but the path for this TCE rule is a little bit more convoluted. So where it was originally to go into effect back in March. It has been postponed to June, but now also there's some judicial review that's occurring with the TCE rule. So the future of the TCE rule is a little cloudy. So with that in mind, as we go through this presentation, you'll see I don't have fixed dates for the TCE rule because it's all going to depend on when the actual effective date of the TCE rule is, and if maybe the TCE rule changes a little bit because of the judicial review that's currently going on. But regardless, there is still an EPA page dedicated to this rule with the associated fact sheets and compliance guides available as well. Now, each of these rules is organized similarly. So if you read through these rules, you will see that they are structured with a staggered implementation dates according to kind of the life cycle perspective of the product. And when we say the life cycle perspective of the product, you'll see that within these rules, there are due dates and requirements for manufacturers of the TCE, PCE, or methylene chloride containing product. There are prohibition dates and obligations for the distributors, whether those distributors are sending directly to a retail application or an industrial commercial use application. You have processors within the life cycle. So when we start to talk about some of the dates of these rules, just recognize this is kind of the life cycle perspective that the rules are structured around. Manufacturers, processors, distributors, and then the associated use, whether it's retail, commercial, industrial, or what we call specific conditions of use. And what we mean by specific conditions of use is these are the authorized uses that will be able to continue so long as strict workplace practices are implemented. So, in addition to the prohibitions that we'll be talking about, for those authorized continued use, the specific conditions of use, for those businesses that are allowed to continue to use these, there are going to be strict workplace protections. We will, in the next section, we will go through what those workplace protections are. And then also recognize that the structure of these rules also include record keeping and downstream notifications for those that manufacture, process, or dispose of these chemicals of concern. What you see there on the screen is just a snapshot of what some of the required language is, the downstream notification language. This one is specifically from the methylene chloride rule. But for those that are authorized to continue to manufacture for some of those specific conditions of use, Section 15 of the Associated Safety Data Sheet is going to have very specific language as a part of some of the record keeping and downstream notifications. So again, each of these rules are structured similarly. Prohibitions that affect various components of the life cycle, strict workplace protections, and then record keeping and downstream notifications. Now, starting first, we want to just talk about some of these prohibition dates and some of these specific conditions of use. And then we'll get into the workplace protections in the next section. So looking first at the methylene chloride rule. So looking at the methylene chloride rule, after February 3rd of 2025, so we were already past that date, all persons are prohibited from distributing in commerce methylene chloride, including any methylene chloride containing products specifically to retailers. In other words, distributors cannot sell methylene chloride products to any retailers after February the 3rd. Now, after May 5th, again, another date that has already passed us by, after May 5th of 2025, all retailers are prohibited from distributing in commerce methylene chloride, including any methylene chloride containing products for any use in retail. This means that retailers cannot distribute methylene chloride products to any customer, including commercial users, after May the 5th. Also, after May the 5th, all persons are prohibited from manufacturing, including the import of methylene chloride, except for the conditions of use that may continue under strict workplace protections. Stay tuned for what those conditions of use are and what those workplace protections are. After August 1st of 2025, all persons will be prohibited from processing methylene chloride, including any methylene chloride containing products, except for the conditions of use that may continue under those strict workplace protections. Now, after January the 28th of 2026, all persons are going to be prohibited from distributing in commerce methylene chloride, including those methylene chloride containing products, again, except for those conditions of use that may continue under those strict workplace protections. And then finally, after April the 28th of 2026, all persons are prohibited from industrial or commercial use of methylene chloride, including any of those methylene chloride containing products. Again, remember that 0.1% de minimis in those products, except for those conditions of use that may continue. Now, there are extended timeframes up to May 8th of 2029 for specific uses associated with cultural and historical preservation and aerospace, structural, or safety critical adhesive and sealant. So a little bit longer time frame for those specific uses. So what are these specific conditions of use? So, in other words, how are we still able to use methylene chloride? So, if you're in the following areas, you will be allowed to continue to use methylene chloride under very strict workplace protections. So, the authorized conditions of continued use include industrial and commercial use as a laboratory chemical, industrial commercial use for paint and coating removal from safety critical corrosion sensitive components of aircraft and spacecraft, industrial commercial use as a bonding agent for solvent welding, industrial and commercial use as a processing aid, industrial and commercial use for plastics and rubber products manufacturing, industrial and commercial use as a solvent that becomes part of the formulation or mixture, where that formulation or mixture will be used inside a manufacturing process, and the solvent, specifically methylene chloride, will be reclaimed. And finally, disposal is continued condition of use as well. Now, details of these individual uses. So if you need specific clarification of what do we mean relative to the paint and coating removal from safety critical corrosion sensitive components of aircraft. In that handout my colleague uploaded, specifically in that handout, there is a link to EPA's guide for complying with methylene chloride rule. It's that two or three page user friendly guide. Excuse me, the guide is the longer, the fact sheet is a 2 or 3 page, but the longer document that is linked there, which is the compliance guide, in Appendix B of that compliance guide, it further defines each of these conditions of use. So you can go in, read the additional details of these conditions of use and be like, yep, that seems to describe my operations. And then you'll know you are able to continue to use it. You'll just have to put into place those specific workplace practices. Now, also for the conditions of use for methylene chloride, those in the manufacturing part of the supply chain, that is manufacturing those methylene chloride products for those conditions of use, are continued to be authorized. But if it's a manufacturer that is manufacturing them for other purposes, then that May 5th, 2025 prohibition ban stands. Similarly, those in the supply chain that are processing methylene chloride for those authorized conditions of use can continue to do so, but those that are processing it for other reasons cannot process that methylene chloride after August the 1st of this year. All right, so let's talk about the PCE rule next. So, PCE rule again is structured similarly with these prohibition bans, and also the PCE rule does have those specific uses that are authorized, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, with the PCE rule, also known as PERC, after June the 11th of 2026, all persons are prohibited from manufacturing PCE except for industrial and commercial uses that may continue under strict workplace protections and dry cleaning. One thing that's important to note when I say the word manufacturing, I mean importing as well. So manufacturing includes import. So after June the 11th of 2026, persons are prohibited from manufacturing and importing PCE and these PCE products for those industrial commercial uses, except for those that are authorized for continued use or dry cleaners. After September the 9th of 2026, all persons are prohibited from processing PCE, including those PCE containing products, except for those industrial and commercial uses that can continue under those strict workplace practices. After December 8th, all persons are going to be prohibited from distributing in commerce PCE and PCE containing products to retailers other than those that are associated with dry cleaning. After May the 8th, all persons are prohibited from distributing in commerce PCE, including those PCE containing products, except for the industrial and commercial use that may continue under those workplace protections and dry cleaning. Also, after May 8th of 2027, all retailers are going to be prohibited from distributing in commerce any of these PCE containing products. After June the 7th of 2027, all persons are going to be prohibited from industrial commercial use of PCE, except for those that are going to be authorized for continued use and dry cleaning. So, what are these continued specific uses, and what specifically is going to be authorized or eventually prohibited relative to dry cleaning? So, relative to dry cleaners, if we have any dry cleaners on the line, June 16th of 2025, you're going to be prohibited from using PCE in newly acquired dry cleaning machines. After December the 20th of 2027, you're going to be prohibited from use of dry cleaning and related spot cleaning in third generation machines relative to these PCE and PCE products. And then relative to the PERC, the PCE products, after December 19th of 2034, so roughly about 10 years or so out, you're going to be prohibited from PERC in all dry cleaning and related spot cleaning. So there will be eventually a ban for PCE in dry cleaning. It's just a bit of a phase out approach here with about a 10-year lead time until it's completely banned from dry cleaning. Now, the conditions of use, so those in industry and commercial uses, these are the 7 or so continued conditions of use. Remember, if you're going to be using them in these uses, there will be very strict workplace practices that we'll talk about in the next section. So, PCE can be continued to be used in industrial and commercial uses as a solvent for open top batch vapor degreasing, as well as closed loop batch vapor degreasing. Also, industrial and commercial use as a maskant in chemical milling, or as a solvent-based adhesive and sealant, or processing aid in catalyst regeneration in petrochemical manufacturing, processing aid in sectors other than petrochemical manufacturing. Also, industrial commercial use as a cold cleaning of tank vessels. And then lastly, disposal is still going to be authorized. And then similarly to what we saw in the methylene chloride rule, manufacturing and processing do have those prohibition dates that are going to take effect unless it's being manufactured relative to these authorized use. So manufacturers will be able to continue to manufacture so long as it's being used for one of those conditions of use authorized on the previous page. Otherwise, there's going to be a ban starting June the 11th of next year. Similarly, processing is going to be banned after September the 9th of 2026 unless it's supporting one of those previously stated conditions of use. Now, the PCE rule does have two other kind of sidebar requirements or authorizations. So those of you on the line that might be associated with laboratories, PCE, there are workplace requirements for laboratory use. So after December the 15th of this year, laboratories can continue to use PCE. However, they must install laboratory ventilation devices, make sure those laboratory ventilation devices are working appropriately, and provide dermal protection for those laboratory settings. So if you're on the line and you're associated with laboratory use and you're using PCE, then I'll point you to the PCE rule and specifically the workplace requirements for laboratory use. Similarly, if you're on the line and you're in an industry that uses energized electrical cleaners, there are workplace requirements for energized electrical cleaning use of PCE. And after March the 13th of next year, you're going to have to self-certify to the rule and implement specific controls for purchase and use as an energized electrical cleaning. So there's a whole section of the regulation for laboratory use and a whole section of the regulation for the energized electrical cleaner use of PCE. And then similarly, looking at the registration, I didn't see anybody on the line from NASA, but PCE rule has a 10-year exemption for NASA relative to emergency use. And then finally, we get to the TCE rule. And again, this one is kind of circled in uncertainty right now due to some court action. So we really don't know what the prohibition dates are yet due to the court action. But as the rule is currently written and published, TCE will eventually be banned in all uses. But just kind of stay tuned as we see what the result of that court action is going to be. There are some, instead of the specific conditions of use like we saw for methylene chloride and PCE, the TCE rule is currently structured to where there are specific conditions of use that are temporary. They just have longer phase out times. And if you're in those categories, you're eventually going to have to phase out the TCE, and you're going to have to implement the workplace practices until that time that you do phase it out. All right. So let's talk about these workplace chemical protections. So if you're using methylene chloride in one of those continued authorized uses, if you're using PCE in one of those continued authorized uses, what are you going to have to do to protect those potentially exposed people from the hazards? Remember, the whole reason why we have these rules is because these chemicals pose an unreasonable risk. So how are we going to protect potentially exposed persons from those unreasonable risks? And that takes us to these workplace chemical protection programs. So the Workplace Chemical Protection Program, each of the rules are kind of structured similarly. They all have exposure limits that you're going to have to do exposure monitoring to make sure you're below the exposure limits. If you're not below the exposure limits, then you're going to have to put into place what we call like regulatory areas and specific controls. We're going to have exposure control procedures and plans we're going to have to implement. We're going to potentially have respiratory protection, especially if we're not below those exposure limits. We're going to need to have dermal protection because remember, each of these chemicals of concern, the routes of entry are both inhalation as well as dermal. So we're going to have dermal protection, and then we're going to have training. And so in this section, you'll just see these side-by-side comparison of what these limits are, what these regulatory dates are, depending on which of these chemicals that you might be using at your facility. Now, please note, in this section, all dates shown are for non-federal employers. There are longer compliance dates for federal agencies and federal contractors acting on behalf of the federal government. So the dates that I have here are for those non-federal employers. If you find yourself in that federal agencies or federal contractor acting directly on behalf of a federal agency, then those longer deadlines, you can refer to those handouts that are linked, those websites that are linked in the handout. All right, so methylene chloride. Methylene chloride is going to have what we call an ECL. ECL is the acronym ECEL, which stands for Existing Chemical Exposure Limit. So methylene chloride is going to have an existing chemical exposure limit of 2 parts per million over an 8-hour time-weighted average. Methylene chloride also has an action level of 1 part per million over an 8-hour time-weighted average, and also has what we call a short-term exposure limit, or STEL, of 16 parts per million over 15 minutes. If any of you are on the line are familiar with the OSHA standard for methylene chloride, you will recognize these limits as much lower than what OSHA currently has for methylene chloride. So if you're using methylene chloride in one of these conditions of authorized use, you're going to have to monitor your employee exposure, those potentially exposed persons. You're going to have to do your initial monitoring by May the 5th. So that's a date that's already come and gone. So if you were unaware and you hadn't done that yet, then please make sure that you do kind of escalate that within your timetable to make sure you go ahead and do that, because the initial monitoring did have to be completed by earlier this month. And then if you're introducing methylene chloride as an authorized use in the future, you're going to have 30 days to do that monitoring. You are going to have to periodically update that monitoring as required, and the frequency is going to be dictated by the results. If your ECHO results are pretty high relative to that standard, you're going to have a much more frequent periodic monitoring requirement. And if you're below it, then you're going to have a lower frequency. But everybody, whether you're above or below the ECHO and you're continuing to use methylene chloride, you're going to have to periodically update that monitoring. And then there's a compliance date of August 1st. And what we mean by compliance date is that you need to either get your ECHO below these, the ECHO and the cells below these limits, or you're going to have to put into place PPE, such as respiratory protection, regulatory areas, and so on, if we're not in compliance with these exposure limits. PCE has an ECHO of 0.1 parts per million over an 8-hour time-weighted average. The initial monitoring for PCE is going to be later this year, so December 15th of this year is when you're going to need to do that initial monitoring. So if you have a continued authorized use of PCE and you have not started making progress toward that initial monitoring, I highly recommend you go ahead and hop on that. If you're going to be introducing PCE in the future under one of these authorized use, you have 30 days to do that initial monitoring. Similar to methylene chloride, you're going to have periodic and updated monitoring requirements, whether it's process change or it's just the routine evaluation that's going to be dictated by your actual exposure levels. And again, you have a compliance date of March the 13th of next year on this one. And again, what we mean by compliance date is we need to be under that ECHO, or we're going to have respiratory protection put in place, regulated areas put into place. And then the TCE, the dates, you'll see here I have the dates relative to whatever the eventual effective date is. Right now, we could potentially be looking at an effective date of the rule of June of this year, but it's all going to be dictated by the results of the court action. So you see here we have an ECHO and an interim action level that's established for TCE, with the initial monitoring within 180 days of the effective date, whether that effective date it starts this June or at a future date and time. Similar periodic and updated monitoring with either process changes or just the routine monitoring that's going to be dictated by the actual monitoring results. And the compliance date relative to these exposure limits for TCE is going to be 270 days from the eventual effective date of this rule. So exposure monitoring needs to be completed using established industrial hygiene monitoring practices and test protocols. here at HRP, we kind of had an internal meeting with one of our labs relative to these rules about a couple of weeks ago. And these ECHLs that have been established for these pollutants of concern are really low. And so we're seeing that it's requiring a little bit of additional coordination with our labs, because we're seeing that we're having to collect more volume than maybe we would if we were just looking at this from a straight OSHA perspective. We need to make sure that we're collecting enough volume for the lab to actually run and be able to run the analytical analysis that can be compared to such low limits. So just approaching this like a normal standard industrial hygiene project is not necessarily the case here. It takes a little bit more coordination relative to working with the labs and the monitoring practices. And also be aware, relative to the exposure monitoring here, potentially exposed persons have the right to observe any monitoring of the occupational exposure associated with these chemicals. So if you have an employee that's working in the area of PERC, let's say, and they want to observe, whether you're internally doing the exposure monitoring or you're bringing in a third party, if they want to observe those activities, they have the right to do so. You also must inform each person whose exposures are monitored, or who's part of kind of that exposure group. In other words, employees that are doing similar tasks in similar areas. You must let them know of the results of the exposure monitoring within 15 working days of your receiving those results. So you can't just do this monitoring and tuck the information aside in a file. You have to share the results with those potentially exposed persons. Now, the regulated area, when I was talking about compliance dates relative to the exposure monitoring, if we have an area where the ECHL is going to be above those limits or reasonably expected to be above those limits, then we're going to have what we call a regulated area, which is an area demarcated by the employer where an employee's exposure to the airborne concentration of the chemical, whether it's methylene chloride, PCE or TCE, exceeds or can be reasonably expected to exceed that ECHL or that STEL. And so typically we'll see these areas, maybe they're an enclosed area, maybe it's an area that is painted a certain way and only certain employees can go into that painted area. So we'll see various ways of how regulated areas are designated, but it's going to be a designated, demarcated, visually identifiable regulated area where within that area these exposure limits could be potentially exceeded. In establishing the regulated area, this is something that is common in OSHA standards. So referring to both the associated TSCA rule, whether it's methylene chloride, PCE or TCE, as well as just referencing OSHA's best practices for regulated areas, is recommended if you have to establish such an area. And then the compliance dates for these regulated areas we shared on a slide previous, but they're also here for you on this slide as well. Now, in addition to the exposure monitoring, you also have to have an exposure control procedure and plan. So if you are in one of those categories of continued authorized use, you're going to have to establish procedures and a plan. Whether you're below those exposure limits or not, you're going to have one of these exposure control procedures and plans. So continued under the authorized use, one must institute one or a combination of controls. If you can't demonstrate exposure below that ECHL, then you're also going to be implementing a respiratory protection program in those regulated areas as well. And when we say you're going to have to institute a combination of controls, within the health and safety arena, we speak of the hierarchy of controls. If you can't eliminate the use of the chemical of concern, if you can't substitute the chemical of concern, then you're going to be looking at engineering controls, maybe such as ventilation, or other similar engineering controls, administrative controls like training, and then PPE like respiratory protection. So you're going to be using some combination of these controls to limit the exposure and prevent the potential exposure. Because remember, these chemicals have been deemed to pose an unreasonable risk, and so we're trying to mitigate those risks. And so you have to develop and implement the exposure control plan. And your dates by which you must develop and implement these plans are noted there on the screen, depending on what chemical of concern you're working with. So, for example, right now we are working with an industrial lab that is using methylene chloride. You may recall from a few slides ago, laboratory use is one of the authorized continued uses for methylene chloride. So, we're helping an industrial lab with their exposure control plan right now. Already done the monitoring and everything, and thankfully everything's below those levels. But we're putting into place this exposure control plan to keep those levels, below the ECHL. Also to implement things like training and the combination of controls to mitigate the risk as much as possible. And in drafting these exposure control plans, the required content is similar across all three of these rules. We have to identify the exposure controls that we considered, including those that were used or not used, and taking into account those hierarchy of controls. So in other words, a bit of a feasibility review here. For each exposure control considered, a rationale of why the exposure control was selected or not selected, based off of feasibility, effectiveness, or other relevant considerations, a description of the actions that must be taken to implement the exposure control selected, including proper installation, regular inspections, maintenance, training, or other actions. So, for example, if we're implementing ventilation, we need to make sure that that ventilation is properly installed, that we are integrating the manufacturer specifications relative to the degree of inspections and the frequency of those inspections and preventive maintenance and so on. A description of the regulated area and how we've demarcated that regulated area and what persons are authorized to enter those regulated areas. You don't want just anybody walking into those regulated areas. A description of the activities to review and update the exposure control plan, ensuring its effectiveness, and identify any updates that might be needed, and confirm that the persons are properly implementing the exposure control plan. So, kind of a little routine audit, if you will, of the plan and its effectiveness. And then finally, management of change protocols for changes associated with the regulated chemicals. So, if we're using one of these chemicals in a continued authorized use, and we somehow have some type of process change, whether we're running the equipment more often or running the equipment in a different way, we need to make sure that we're capturing those changes through a management of change procedure, and we're updating our exposure monitoring as a result of those changes. Please note you cannot use job rotation to apply with the ECHLs, so you cannot bake in job rotations to these plans. The plans must be maintained, and the effectiveness of the controls instituted. You're going to have to review the plans at least every 5 years, but more frequently with changes. And you must let potentially exposed persons know of the availability of the plan, specifically in a language they can understand, within 30 days of that plan being completed, and then annually thereafter. Remember, these solvents or these chemicals of concern have both inhalation hazards as well as dermal protection. So depending on the contaminant that you might be particularly using, whether it's methylene chloride, PCE, or TCE, you see here that there are specific dermal protections that have to be implemented by specific dates. So for example, if you're using PCE, you're going to have to specifically separate, distance, or physically remove or isolate the person from direct contact by March the 13th of 2026. Where with methylene chloride and TCE, they're allowing PPE, but you'll notice here under the PCE rule, they're essentially saying you have to use either engineering controls or administrative controls to specifically separate or distance from the dermal contact of PCE. Respiratory protection if required. So if we have not met those exposure limits and we're having to put potentially exposed persons into respiratory protection, we're going to need to provide that respiratory protection in those regulated areas within 3 months of monitoring or an indication of the exceedance. And just make sure that you're referencing the OSHA program for respiratory protection, which is going to include medical evaluation. It's going to include fit testing. It's going to include proper selection of the respiratory protection. So it'll be a completely additional regulatory program you'll need to make sure that you're dotting the I's on and crossing the T's on. And then training is going to be required. And this training is going to specifically kind of speak to the PPE, the regulatory areas, what we're doing to keep those exposure limits within a reasonable anticipated amount, and the dates for the respiratory protection if needed, and the training you'll see is presented there depending on the contaminant of concern. So this slide here is just kind of a snapshot for each chemical of concern, what the dates are for the initial exposure monitoring, what the date is for ensuring that we're in compliance with that ECHL and establishing regulatory areas or PPE if needed, and then the date of the required exposure control plan, including the implementation and notification of the plan. So all of that is just kind of highlighted here on one page for you. And then kind of wrapping up here is just the record keeping associated with this rules. No environmental health and safety rule is complete without some type of record keeping requirement. So you're going to see a 5-year record retention requirement associated with these rules. And the records that are going to be required to maintain is going to kind of depend on where you fall in that life cycle perspective. If you're a manufacturer, distributor, processor, you're going to have shipping records as a part of your record keeping. If you are a user, an authorized user, your record keeping is going to be associated with things like your exposure control plan, your proof of plan implementation, your PPE records, your training information, your monitoring results. And again, if you're in that distribution side, part of your record keeping is going to be the downstream notifications that are required. So your record keeping is going to depend on where you fall in the supply chain or in the life cycle perspective. Just make sure that you are putting into place practices to keep those records for at least 5 years. So kind of wrapping up here with some of our final recommendations, and I see we've got a few questions that have come through, so even if it takes us a little into overtime, I'll be sure to answer each of your questions. So our final recommendations here is review your supply chain, review the materials that you're using in your processes, and see if you have methylene chloride, PCE or TCE above those regulatory limits for each of those chemicals of concerns. If you do, then make sure that you have either already implemented or are implementing those monitoring programs. We recommend you engage with a certified industrial hygienist just to ensure best practices are being deployed. But make sure that you are doing those initial monitoring, you're evaluating the results of that monitoring, and you are implementing controls as appropriate based off of that monitoring. Also, if you find that you have these chemicals, most importantly, read and familiarize yourself with the rules themselves. In one of the handouts, we have the links to all the resources, whether it's the 2-page fact sheet or the more robust compliance guide. Make sure you familiarize yourself with that content. Ensure you have a good process change procedure in place that accounts for introducing new chemicals so that you can identify maybe you've got one of these chemicals that's coming in, or if you know you're already using these chemicals, have a good process change procedure in place. So if you do make some type of process change, you're able to reevaluate your controls, you're able to reinstitute your monitoring, so you can make sure that you are continuing to mitigate the potential risk to those employees. And then stay up to date relative to other chemicals under risk review. These 3 are not the only ones. When the Lautenberg Act was first passed, there was an initial 10, and more chemicals will be added. So just as info, where we talked about methylene chloride, TCE, and PCE, there's also a final risk management rule for carbon tetrachloride, organized very similarly to these rules we talked about. So if you're using carbon tetrachloride, recognize that most everything that I said today about the other chemicals could also apply to carbon tetrachloride, and familiarize yourself with that rule. The ones that are have proposed rules out that are similar to these we talked about today are 1-bromopropane, CI pigment violet 29, and N-methylpyridine. I think I said that one correctly. I am not a chemist. And there are others, chemicals that are in various phases of their risk evaluation, and depending on the results of those risk evaluations, may or may not have final risk management rules associated with them. So we have both in your handout, and you see there on the screen, just EPA's website that is designated to all these chemicals that are in some phase of the risk assessment. All right, so I'm about to take a look at the questions that have been rolling through here. But I'm going to leave just this slide showing as I read and review some of these questions, just our upcoming webinars, in-person training, and online training that's available should you have other topics of interest. So feel free to access hrpassociates.com training for additional upcoming training opportunities. And actually, I'll leave it on the slide as I go through the questions, so you'll see my direct contact information if you have a question that you just didn't feel like typing in. So give me 2 seconds here as I catch up on these questions that have been entered into the chat. So in terms of having exposure monitoring and control practices, how do we prioritize between OSHA versus EPA? Even if the result shows less than OSHA but more than EPA, do we still have to have respiratory programs in place? Yes. So when there is conflict between the OSHA limit and the EPA limit, you go with whatever limit is the lowest. So if you are currently in compliance with OSHA, great. But if you're not currently in compliance with these ECHLs under these rules, then recognize you're going to have to put into place all of the protections that are noted in these TSCA rules. So even if you're in compliance with OSHA, but you're not in compliance with these ECHLs, if you're above the ECHL, yes, you're going to be putting your employees into respiratory protection. And yes, that means all of what is necessary under an OSHA respiratory protection program. We have a question here. This one is specific to methylene chloride, but I'm going to answer this relative to all three. If methylene chloride or PCE or TCE rule, does it apply to all chemicals that contain that material or only 100%? It is all products that contain. And if you give me 2 seconds here, I'm going to jump back to a slide. The regulatory limit, it just happens that in these three rules, the regulatory threshold is the same. So we're looking at 100% or any products that contain 0.1% or more of each of these chemicals. So that's the threshold for each of these chemicals is 0.1%. So not 100%, but that percentage there. Oops, trying to get back to my contact page. All right, let's see. I've got a couple more here. Let me scroll up and catch up here. So there's a question here, what does the asterisk for the dates mean? So as mentioned earlier, all the dates that I have in this presentation are relative to the non-federal government employers. So that asterisk is referring to all the dates are for non-federal employers. If you are a federal employer or a contractor operating directly on behalf of a federal employer, recognize you just have a little bit longer time. So we have a question here, and I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not going to be able to answer the question specifically off the top of my head, but there is a question here. Does the coating removal used for methylene chloride include typical degreasing units? So again, I'm going to hop back to that particular page relative to the rule. So I'm assuming we're talking here. These are the specific uses that are authorized for methylene chloride. So using as a laboratory chemical is allowed. For paint or coating removal from safety critical corrosion sensitive components of aircraft and spacecraft only, for bonding agents for solvent welding, processing aid, plastic and rubber products manufacturing, and a solvent that will become a part of a formulation or mixture where that formulation or mixture will be used inside a manufacturing process and the solvent methylene chloride will be reclaimed. So I don't see any of these authorized uses where it comes into degreasing. So I'm not seeing where methylene chloride for degreasing is going to be a continued authorized use. But if you think degreasing might be baked into one of these continued authorized uses, then I encourage you to look at Appendix B of EPA's guide for complying with the methylene chloride rule, just to see if there is any indication there. But I'm not seeing where methylene chloride can be continued to be used for degreasing. All right, let's see. So, we've got a question here, and I'll just be honest, I don't think anybody can answer this right now. Relative to the litigation process under TSCA and what that will mean, I can't tell you. I wish I could predict, but I just can't. The only rule that I understand to be tied up in court action is the TCE rule. I have seen nothing where there's any pause or any breaks applied to the methylene chloride or the PCE rule. The only rule that I understand as being tied up in court action and uncertainty is the TCE rule. Your guess is as good as mine is what's going to play out relative to that. So just stay tuned. Got another question here relative to demarcating the regulated areas. Is there best practices? There are best practices. OSHA has a lot more information and guidance relative to establishing regulated areas. You'll see that under subpart Z of the OSHA General Industry Standard. So working with your health and safety professionals to leverage those best practices for regulated areas. I'll point you to OSHA for those. So, asking here about what type of gloves for methylene chloride. Again, that's not a question I can answer off the top of my head because this rule applies to not only pure methylene chloride or PCE or TCE, but also products containing. And so, because a product containing methylene chloride could have various number of properties and components that could impact the PPE selection. I will say again, this is where we highly recommend, if we go back to our recommendations page, I highly recommend that you engage with certified industrial hygienists or your health and safety professionals because there is definitely an art and a science to selecting appropriate PPE, specifically gloves, in consultation with maybe information that might be available in the safety data sheet for the specific product, in consultation with how the material is actually being used and the environment in which it's being used. So, where I cannot answer in general term what's going to be the best glove, I can more speak to the process that should be deployed to selecting the appropriate glove, and that is engaging with your health and safety professionals, doing a PPE assessment, a PPE certified assessment, just like OSHA requires, taking into account all of the nuances and details of the specific use and the specific material. But the EPA standard does not say thou shalt use this particular glove or that particular glove. It's more that you have to do a PPE selection. All right, I think I have caught up on all the questions. If you entered in a question and I just overlooked it, I apologize. Feel free to ping me. Again, I will land here on my contact information. Again, I'm Jackie Baxley. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, whether you want to give me a call or shoot me an email. Also, stay connected with HRP. We're very active on various media campaigns. So as we know more about what's going to be the fate of the TCE rule, for example, we will post it on all of our platforms. We'll email you since you are a part of this webinar. We'll keep you informed as we become informed and we navigate whatever the results of the current court action are. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your time and attention. And stay tuned for future webinars, and we hope to see you back again.